tonight we have the special broadcast of the Sunday show, the only TV program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. We are in our Kiev headquarters, but we have the special screening and special guest. Yevhen Fedchenko is the Dean of the Kiev Mohyla School of Journalism, one of the best media schools here in Ukraine, but also co-founder of very well-known already worldwide initiative StopFake, which is more or less for the 3 years on a daily basis for more than 1,000 days is documenting the fake news and stories regarding, at first, situation in Ukraine, but not just this. So, good night.
Night.
And why we have this occasion, there is a documentary which is produced by the British journalist Team White, but as well the StopFake initiative is also had the idea to make this story. So, just first, explain what we will see tonight.
Yeah, so this documentary was meant to explain the Ukrainian context of fake news, why it was important in Ukraine 3 years ago to start this conversation, how to translate those issues to the wider audience outside of Ukraine, why it would be important to people in other countries to look into this topic and to understand the impact of fake news on decision-making process in every particular media system, every country. And between the beginning of the war in Ukraine and where we are now, we had a lot of other events where Russian propaganda was much influential and also influenced elections, influenced other important national political events. So that's why we decided that we need to tell our story and to put it into the more universal European and wider context.
Yevhen, for these 3 years, you've been talking to hundreds conferences, events to different decision makers, explaining the nature of the fake news. But what we see that today the Western media and some Western experts are coming here to Ukraine and to you in particular to kind of learn your know-how, because there are the fake news in other countries, people looking at the ideas, maybe somebody even despite that's not connected to you are creating their own fact-checking departments. So really, at the stage of today, what are the most interesting things people want to know from your experience, from the experience this region experience with the defamation, with disinformation and information war?
Yeah, you're right. Ukraine became the very first place where disinformation model was used in a way it was used when the Crimean annexation started, or even earlier before, during last days of Euromaidan. And this experience is very interesting because Ukraine was among the very first places where Russia was using information warfare alongside with traditional kinetic warfare, because in other areas we could see the either example of kinetic warfare or information warfare. And Ukraine was the very first place where it happened at the same times and were complementing each other. So that's why the lessons from Ukraine are so interesting and so important. What other countries can learn from Ukrainian experience? And the main question they have: is Russian disinformation model used in Ukraine can be easily transferred to any other country? And our answer is yes, it easily can, because the toolbox used here is pretty much universal. So it's based on the Soviet system of the active measures. You can improvise with them, you can complement them with the most recent achievements of technologies like social media, websites, bots, hacking and other things, but the basis of it is a Soviet model of active measures, and it can be easily moved from one country to another and used depending on the particular problems in each country. So unlike Soviet system, where the universal model was used from country to country, the contemporary Russian propaganda is very customized from country to country. So they really look into the local problems in each country. They speak the local language of each country. They use the local problems of each country and just monetize on them. in terms of political, of course, capital. For example, if we would look at Baltic states, they would be using pretty much the same instruments as they've been using in Ukraine. If we would go then to France, they would be using the same channels to spread disinformation, but that would be localized around local issues like migrants, security connected to migrants, Islamist threats and other things. But again, the instruments they would be using for disseminating disinformation would be pretty much the same. So another issue, what people are interested to know, how disinformation is connected to the things on the ground, how it's connected to the policy making and conduct of military warfare. Again, it's pretty much connected, and in Ukrainian case, all disinformation can easily be put into the thematic frames which reflect the things on the ground. So disinformation was either creating the grounds for military warfare, or was complementing military warfare, or was explaining why it was happening.
What's important to understand, there is always the change. There are different trends in what we are speaking. At first we would speak about Crimea, then Donbass, then something else, MH17, then the US elections. But what are the most important stories today? What are the trends? Sometimes you say Ukraine is a failed state, then something else about another country. So locally, if we speak, what are the trends, how the Ukraine is portrayed at this stage? What are the stories? What are the made-up stories? And globally as well? Yeah,
so as I said, propaganda is very adaptive. So they look for the contemporary important issues within each society. And so for Ukraine, they really pick up the issues which would be either important for Ukrainian domestic landscape or for putting Ukraine in very unfavorable position internationally and compromise basically any Ukrainian efforts. So now the main topics would be Ukraine as a failed state. So there's 3 years on, they still continue to prove that Ukraine is not a real state, and they always quote in either weakness or absence of political institutions, or they quote the unsuccessful economic reforms and corruption which dominate in Ukraine to prove that Ukraine basically already collapsed. And also we see the growing amount of war-related fakes again, which was always around. And also they pick up important even cultural issues like upcoming Eurovision contest. So we have a growing number of fakes around this politically unimportant at the first sight event, but for propaganda that's really as an opportunity to portray Ukraine in a very unfavorable way, to make sure that people would have doubts about Ukraine's ability to host the competition, if it would be safe for people to come because of the war, fascist, nationalist, and all other things and other things.
There are particular things connected to the foreign policy. For instance, we see these romance between Putin and Trump, but it had more or less changed in some way. We are following the French elections. So what impact it has? What is the message?
Yeah, so of course Russian propaganda is trying to put Ukrainian stories into international context, and we see that they really try to find the ground to compromise Ukraine as important international player, to explain that Ukraine is not fulfilling its obligations, is not a partner to any kind of negotiations. And also we see a lot of bilateral troubles created from outside, like the troubles in Ukraine-Polish relationships, for example, which are fueled from outside very extensively, and they really trying to find any prerequisite to make this conflict looking real, and to make sure that Ukraine and Poland would really have their relations very, very tense. Or, for example, the implementation of visa-free travel for Ukrainians. So they really try to portray it as something unimportant, unsubstantial, that Europe will not allow Ukrainians anyway to move freely around because they don't want to see Ukrainians in Europe. So that's again putting the story into a bigger context that Ukraine definitely should belong to Russian sphere of influence, and any Ukrainian attempts to go outside of this vicious circle is really explained as something impossible, and that Ukraine is actually not welcomed over there.
What I found already interesting, so the stories you are speaking, they're really targeted on the foreign audience, and some of them on the Russian audience. And I think that the Ukrainian audience had become more resilient. I mean, we are not speaking about the people living on the occupied territories. The fake headline I've picked up as one of, an exciting one from your initiatives from the StopFake was the, I would have it, the Islamic battalion had had helped Ukrainians to move chemical weapons to the Middle East. So kind of a really interesting conspiracy. But we have just discussed how the content had developed, the trends. But had there been something new within these 3 years from the point of view of the technology, from the way how this, fake news are proliferated? What's new on that front line?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of changes here and a lot of sophistication in this process, because 3 years ago we started with very simple scenes with photo fakes, video fakes, which were very easy to debunk. And then we moved along to more substantial textual fakes, which sometimes much more difficult to debunk because they combine truth and lies in one piece, and you really need to kind of to split it into different layers to understand, is a story true in general or no? There was a lot of progress in terms of using different technologies. So if we go back to the headline you just quoted, we basically see that this is a perfect headline for hashtags, for social media, and for all those people who would never go to the article itself. So that's basically for the audience which consume news at the level of headlines very quickly, just having a quick look at what's going on, and just would have the impression, because we have all the important hashtags here, Islamist, chemical weapon, and other things combined in one. So that's really a good example of how the headline can be manipulated to be shared very actively, to be actively consumed by the audience, and to send the very important signals to the international audience that Ukraine is really supporting Islamists in proliferation of the chemical, or sometimes they say nuclear weapons around different regions. And this is really a very important message to put Ukraine in the most unfavorable light.
We were speaking about the Kremlin propaganda. Have we mentioned that there are other regimes, other governments using the same techniques?
Yeah, of course it was not Kremlin.
Or like learning from this experience.
Yeah, it was not Kremlin that invented propaganda, and many other governments are trying to use it. But again, as soon as Ukraine is positioned in a way that we are subjected all the time to influence of Russian propaganda, we mostly study that, but we can find a lot of examples of Chinese propaganda or North Korean propaganda. But of course, that would be not about Ukraine, and they are not that much targeting European region in general, but they would be mostly working with domestic audience and so on. But Russian propaganda is very interesting because it's really very opportunistic in terms of how it uses different emerging opportunities in different countries and use the political context of each country, and that's what makes it different compared to other propagandas I mentioned.
How about the Western propaganda? One of the favorite questions probably a lot of people in the West ask?
Yeah, so I'm always asking, give me example of Western propaganda when Western government is promoting their particular destructive agenda into the other countries, and everybody talks about that from the vis-a-vis part of this conversation, but they never provide any examples, and that's basically what makes whataboutism very weak, because as soon as you go to examples, you cannot find anything. So I'm always saying, when you are talking about Ukrainian propaganda, why you would not start StopFake in any other country and make listing of Ukrainian propaganda if you have it? It would be very easy, just debunk it, list it, archive it, and then come up with supporting facts, and nobody is doing that. Why?
Basically, what you are doing is documenting. You're not really just debunking, but that's what you said, for more than 1,000 days. But I think today, when we discuss the fake news and what we do with that, there is a discussion that that's just one part of the story. That, just debunking the fake news isn't really the answer, how you really get out of the thing for the journalism. What you would say on that? That really you are staying in the same discourse. What is your idea? Or what we really do to regain trust if we not just debunk?
Yeah, it was important to start with debunking, because you need to start with something. And with debunking and collecting all those stories in one place, you at least can prove that this does exist, this phenomena is around, it's very influential, it's very vast, and it's very systematic. So that's why debunking was very important. The second issue with debunking, you still can reach out to the new audiences all the time that are still hesitating, that's still undecided on important issues. So when you provide them with alternative explanation for what they've just read or seen, that really makes them start thinking critically about media. And also, when we debunk all those things, we always provide a chance for other point of view to be around, because that's basically, we are talking about internet searches. So if we would just leave RT and Sputnik and other things to be over there, when people would be searching anything about Russia's war against Ukraine or any other issues, they would definitely come only to those propagandistic examples of information or disinformation. If we would be doing debunking, at sooner or later stage, our materials, our debunking would also pop up in their search engines and would provide the opportunity for those people who are interested in getting the other way of thinking about these issues to get our point of view. And with debunking, we come to a more important thing, with proliferation of the culture of media literacy. So we explain that there are many problems in media, but also many problems in the pattern of media consumption of the audiences. So when we explain what's wrong with this particular story, we ask our audience to pay attention. What was wrong with that? Please do not make those mistakes the next time. And it sends very strong signal to different audiences to rethink their consumption model.
And Yevhen, before we go to the screening, so what would be already at this stage, after 3 years of your work, recommendations for how we deal with that?
Yeah, so this documentary, you will see all things related to fake news and propaganda. And the important issue is that it's not about only external factors. Very often, domestic politics provide a lot of opportunities to spread of fake news. So that's always a process in the movement, and there is always an evolution of all those things. So people should really pay attention to what already happened, but also should definitely look into the future, and that's an important message also for us as journalists. So where we are moving journalism from the place where we are now. So yeah, it is problematic. There are many problems and questions to journalists, but where we are taking journalism next.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Every year there are momentous stories in the news, some tales of unbelievable achievement. Some stories inspire us, others can make us concerned, and some news stories will make us angry. But it turns out we can't always believe everything we read and see in the news. My name's Tim White, and I've been investigating.
You are fake news. You are fake news.
Here in Ukraine, they reckon they know a thing or two about fake news. Since the revolution here in 2014, there have been many fake news stories. But is it a new phenomenon? Does it even matter? And what can or should be done to combat the global spread of fake news?
I have hope that we're going to be able to get beyond the post-fact era. I don't think that we can put a tombstone on facts just yet. There are definitely a lot of people out there who realize that fake news is very dangerous, even to social cohesion, at its basest, and they're doing something about it.
For NATO, particularly in the Baltic region, the Russian propaganda's got really good in a way that would have been almost unimaginable back in the 1990s.
The thing with a lie is if you have a lie about something that's happened in the public domain, the shooting down of MH17, if it's happened in a public space, people share information about it online now.
Disinformation is the deliberate spreading of a lie, and the problem is that these days, given the internet, given satellite communications, you can tell a lie in Moscow and literally have it broadcast live in Auckland and Sydney and Vancouver and Beijing simultaneously. So disinformation can spread at the speed of the internet.
In 2016, the US presidential election was memorable for many reasons. But one moment in particular caught the eye of millions. But this story was pure fantasy. Although it didn't stop thousands from believing it, and many shared the story on social media. US-based journalist and filmmaker Simon Ostrovsky remembers it well.
Well, I think the Pope story is a perfect example of a fake news story catching on like wildfire, because the Pope is a well-respected figure for hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people around the world, and for him to have endorsed Donald Trump would have been sending a really important signal to people who were maybe sitting on the fence about his candidacy. And that story, really had an impact. A lot of people saw it, and by the time it was debunked, I don't know whether more people saw the original story or more people saw the debunking.
Of course, call it what you will, fake news or disinformation is nothing new. In the Second World War, Nazi Germany used William Joyce, nicknamed Lord Haw-Haw, to try to demoralize Allied troops with propaganda radio broadcasts. Gregory Asmolov is a Russian-born journalist and researcher now based in London.
So I think that the fake news is not a new phenomenon. We could always see that information is manipulated by different type of institutions in different type of countries, in the West, in Russia, in other places in the world. But as we can see today, the new information technologies provided new tools and new forms of manipulation. It's based on a different type of aspects of information technologies, including something that's called algorithmic power, because today the information that we see, the decision what type of information we see are made not by human agents but often also by some algorithms. For instance, when we follow our Facebook newsfeed, what we see there is actually based on different type of algorithmic aspects of how the newsfeed is structured. And if you understand how this newsfeed works, you to some extent are able to manipulate what is more visible and what is less visible.
I'm here in the heart of London's financial district. Many commuters will get their news from free newspapers such as this, and many more from online sites while on the trains or on the metro. The problem is that fake news is designed to distort reality, and many fear that could lead to instability. One thing's for sure, What financial institutions and the City of London doesn't like is instability.
I think that it's a national security priority for all governments to worry about their information space, who is telling their population things, which bits of the population are believing this and why. They need to think about this in terms of hostile foreign actors, also in terms of domestic subversion such as terrorism, and they need to counter it with a mixture of rebuttal and myth-busting, to some extent looking at the vehicles with which these hostile messages are being got across and seeing if there's anything from a legal or regulatory point of view that needs to be done, and also with strong counter-messaging. We did all this during the Cold War when it was a matter of existential survival, so we knew how to do it, we've just kind of forgotten, and I think we need really to get back into gear in the way we were during the Cold War.
Edward Lucas has written many books and articles about Russia, and he's not alone in his views. One former NATO employee is adamant it's more than just harmless disinformation.
Two nights of rioting in Tallinn, shops set fire, one guy stabbed to death and at least one journalist being assaulted. That's more than just disinformation. Fake news which spreads to thousands of accounts on social media and gets believed and gets regurgitated is more than disinformation. Fake stories that the annexation of Crimea was provoked because NATO was about to set up a naval base there, which then gets repeated in national parliaments by members of parliament, that's a problem. The disinformation is so pervasive and so long-lasting that it gets picked up and it gets recycled, and it gets repeated and it gets believed, and sometimes it gets believed by policymakers.
In recent history, many became aware of fake news for the first time because of events in Ukraine and then Syria. Using modern innovations available to anyone, one British man was on the trail of the purveyors of false facts even before that, with remarkable success.
So I really see it as not something that's intelligence, although there are applications to kind of the intelligence service. Really, I mean, maybe you could call it citizen intelligence if you want. I try not to put a label on it, I just try and encourage more people to do it. What we had with Libya, which is where I started, is lots of kind of reports on social media about events from journalists, and they would drive past a town and say, oh, they're bombing this town or something like that. But I noticed a lot of these stories were being kind of not put together because they were off busy doing something else. So I started looking at this and thinking, well, what if we track this stuff? Then someone, I shared a video once and someone said, well, how do you know this is true? And I thought, actually, how do I know that? So I thought, well, there's a big mosque in it. I'll go to the town mentioned and look at the mosque and see if it's there. And, lo and behold, it was there. It was the same shape and design.
As war raged in Ukraine and Russia denied responsibility, Simon Ostrovsky created a remarkable video, Selfie Soldier. Now back in New York, he explained how the idea came about.
So, I covered the Ukrainian conflict for a couple of years, and one thing that I noticed was how low the levels of trust in media were on both sides of the conflict, because so many fake stories and disinformation were being injected into the information space, frankly, by both sides, by Russia and by Ukraine. And in a conflict environment, this is done to confuse your enemy and to boost morale in your supporters. So it's not the same as with an election here in the United States. It's a bit of a different situation, but the net effect is the same, in that trust in any information that people get is very low. And realizing that it was going to be very, very difficult to convince anybody of anything, I tried to devise a way of showing that I had done the verification myself to try to find out if Russia had used its military in Ukraine. At the time, Russia was denying that any of its forces were involved and that it was a party to the conflict at all. Anybody who had been covering the war realized that that was just simply untrue, but the problem was getting our viewers to understand that. What I did was I traced the social media posts of a Russian soldier who'd been photographing himself in Ukraine. If I just posted those photographs on our news website and said, look, it's a Russian soldier in Ukraine, job done, case closed, people could have very easily said, well, you just took a picture of a Russian soldier from another conflict and wrote your own caption on it. Why should we believe you? So I went out to the places where the soldier actually took the pictures and took pictures of myself in the same poses as he was on the very locations that he took them in order to establish that I had verified where those photographs came from. And then I tracked that soldier down and I found him to show that he was indeed a real soldier in the Russian military.
Also in Ukraine in early 2014, a group of academics and journalists, fed up with Russian propaganda, came up with a new idea.
Я сиділа на роботі, розшифровувала інтерв'ю на іншій роботі, я працюю в ньюзрумі, і заглядала в групу на Фейсбуці, в якій йшло обговорення того, що робити з російською пропагандою, з тією кількістю фейків, яка зараз виникла. І я просто написала 2 рядки, що давайте зробимо сайт, в якому будемо збирати неправдиві новини про Україну і спростовувати їх. Всі підхопили цю ідею. Наша аудиторія дуже схвально сприйняла це. Тобто ми просто були вражені реакцією, насправді, тому що вже через 2 години написали невеличку статтю в інтернеті про те, що створений такий проєкт, який спростовує неправдиву інформацію про події в Україні, зокрема в Криму. І вже за 2 години було 13 тисяч репостів цієї новинки. Тобто ми фактично наступного дня ми вже були популярні. Просто от багато людей нам писали, пропонували допомогу, присилали фейки. Не було проблеми шукати фейкові новини, щоб їх спростовувати. Їх просто присилали, а дехто навіть вже спростовував і присилав готові спростування. Люди дуже дякували нам за те, що ми є. За те, що ми це робимо. Спочатку за це взялися близько 80 людей, волонтерів, всі хотіли брати участь. Потім виявилося, що у всіх є робота, що всі зайняті, всім треба заробляти гроші. Людей ставало все менше, менше і менше. Були моменти, коли ми збиралися просто і говорили, що чи буде існувати проєкт, чи ні. І, звичайно, що доклали всіх зусиль для того, щоб він існував.
Founders of the StopFake site soon realized a more sinister side to proceedings.
So the very first story I wrote for the StopFake website was about Ukrainian refugees in Russia. There were a lot of reports in Russian media, and it was reports about thousands of Ukrainian refugees in Russia. And I called to Federal Migration Service of Russia, and they told me we had just 5 phone calls from people from Ukraine. So we don't understand where this information came from. And so there is no Ukrainian refugees in Russia, the answer is. And, but that lady I called, she told me, but we have received the order from Moscow to prepare hundreds of places for refugees. But there were no refugees. It was 2 months before all the events in the east of Ukraine began. So suddenly I realized that having information about messages they send through their media, you can kind of predict what's going on. And I have a lot of such kind of examples when following and paying attention to messages Russian media and Russian propaganda sends, you can predict the future.
So far we've heard a lot about the history and some of the dangers of fake news. But what's been done to tackle the problem? Well, quite a lot actually. Facebook, Twitter and a host of top international broadcasters now support First Draft, an organisation specifically set up in response to this growing menace.
We had 30 partners, news organisations join in September when we first launched the partner network, and we've got a little over 80 now in terms of organisations who want to work together and find some solutions to this and see how we can verify news and how we can work together to find solutions to these problems that are challenging journalism and media and social media at the moment.
And the general public is using its eagle eyes too.
some of the work we've done with Bellingcat, we've used crowdsourcing, for example, to analyze large amounts of information. When the Russian Ministry of Defense started publishing videos of its bombing of Syria, they had gun camera videos showing the bombs hitting their targets, and they were describing them as being ISIS targets. So we basically crowdsourced these locations. We asked people who were kind of following Bellingcat's work to find these locations on Google Earth. And you're basically, doing spot the difference. You find the satellite image on Google Earth and you look at the, video, and you can see they're the same. What we discovered there is the Russian Ministry of Defense's own videos showed that they were not bombing Islamic State targets.
Donald Trump used the term fake news to strike back against the media, some of whom had reported the existence of a dossier which alleged that Moscow had compromising material on the now president. That report is believed to have been written by Christopher Steele, a former British spy who used to work here at the home of the British Intelligence Service.
CNN reported that a dossier, a two-page summary, of a specific intelligence dossier had been shown to Obama and to Trump. BuzzFeed then published the dossier in full. Now, that to a degree is showing the working of the halls of power in Washington, because decisions were being made, and that dossier had been circulated for months. Trump shouting fake news just at a press conference isn't helpful, and ultimately undermines him to a large degree as well. Just shouting fake news seems desperate to a certain degree, but really, if people are, news organizations, whether that's CNN or BuzzFeed or anyone else, can show why they're doing this in the first place and show the steps that they've taken, hopefully that will help to dispel accusations like that.
And I thought that the dossier on Mr. Trump was a good example of raw intelligence, stuff that had been collected in Russia quite ably from quite interesting range of sources, but it hadn't been checked, because whereas a state intelligence agency can cross-check what its human sources say with other human sources and also with electronic intercepts and what other intelligence agencies are saying, a private intelligence company basically has to go on the basis of what it's been able to collect itself, and that means that the quality of intelligence is much less. Doesn't mean that it is all wrong, but at least some of it is going to be wrong.
So fake news can be a problem on both sides of the Atlantic. It's a hotly debated topic, and Western governments appear to be catching up belatedly.
I think what you've seen is the methods of disinformation have remained pretty constant, and I think of them as the 4 Ds: dismiss, distort, distract, and dismay. So something that I have seen a lot with particularly Russian government communications, but also I must say with other disinformation actors in other areas. If you criticize their action, or if you say that something they've done is wrong, the first thing that will happen is they will dismiss you. They will say, well, you shouldn't even listen to this guy because he used to work at NATO, or because he's a Russophobe, or because he hates Putin, or because he's corrupt, or he's a Nazi, or whatever. They will just dismiss you.
I have what I call the 4 Ps of fake news. They're basically the reasons that it's created, disseminated, and why people share it. So I say there's the propaganda reasons, there's political reasons, there's reasons of passion, and there's reasons for profit.
There was one story which provoked so much anger and was easily debunked, alleging a child had been crucified by Ukrainian nationalists. Many believe this story helped Russia sign up volunteers for the war in Ukraine.
I also could see some kind of emotional wave of anger from the side of people who believe in this story, and some great frustration from people who question this story. So again, you could see that the online follow-up was full of emotions, anger, engagement, and this is the major problem about this type of fake news. It's not only the information which is probably fake, but the way it changed the attitude of people and the way they feel about the conflict, and the way they communicate to other people, and the way this type of fake news actually destroy the social ties between people that were connected before. So this type of polarization, which is caused or supported by fake news, I think it's one of the major challenges that we need to face.
I think that people have been untrustful of the news in Russia for a very long time, and that comes with the Soviet legacy. What's been surprising to me has been that people have been very happy and eager to gobble up, this new phenomenon of Russian fake news on steroids. Because if at least in the early Putin years they tried to stick to the facts and spin it in a way that was helpful to the government, right now we've got a situation where journalists are literally making stories up and falsifying events, portraying them as if they happened when they never did happen. And that's a very big shift from what we've had before. We used to argue about whether news can be unbiased and whether people ever don't have an agenda. Today I think it's shifted way beyond talking about whether stories have an agenda. Today it's whether stories actually took place at all.
It seems like almost everything in our ever-changing world that the techniques used for creating and disseminating propaganda are constantly evolving.
I think that the new thing is you have a very powerful country, Russia, which has real capabilities in hacking, is hacking information and leaking it. That's number one, that they are able to use the anonymity of the internet to create websites that look like news sites but that aren't. They're able to come up with stories that are utterly untrue, like the Lisa case in Germany, and spread these around using the speed and ubiquity of the internet to have a political effect. All these things are quite new compared with the old Soviet model of disinformation, which was much more ponderous and much easier to track.
What has changed is the aggression and the blatancy of the disinformation. There's much more of it. It's much more far out, and it goes right up to the top. The classic example would be President Putin was asked in a press conference in early March 2014, who are those people in Crimea who have now taken over the government buildings, these famous little green men with military uniforms but no insignia. And Putin said, those are local self-defense forces. And later on he said, there are no Russian forces in Ukraine. A year later he said, well, yes, that was a Russian Special Forces operation and I ordered it, and I will tell you all about the meeting where I ordered it and where I said that this had to happen. So you have the president of one of the UN Security Council permanent members blatantly lying in a press conference for an understandable strategic and tactical reason. He wanted to make sure that the operation went ahead. But actually to have a world leader lying like that on camera is relatively rare. And to break, there are many ways of evading the truth. Many leaders do them. Again, this is not a purely Russian thing. But to do a flat-out lie is quite striking.
And some organisations and news outlets have struggled to dodge propaganda.
The question around that would be who is saying what is true and what is not, and how, again, those conclusions are reached. And that's something which Facebook, I think in particular, has been struggling with, and not wanting to be known as a media company because they don't want to be those arbiters of truth. And that's why they're bringing in a number of third parties to do that. Ideally, yes. Ideally, it would only be true information, that is being circulated. But again, the question the follow-on question is that's who decides what's true and what is not. Which is why I think in all of these processes, whether it's social networks, whether it's news organizations, showing the working, being open about how specific conclusions are reached and allowing people to follow that process makes things much less opaque. That's one of the big kickbacks which the last year has shown us from the rise of populism, as many have called it, is because many see the media and news organizations as part of this global elite who are covering things up and pushing a set of interests. And by opening up the reporting process, and whether that's on Facebook or whether that's news organizations into how conclusions are reached, can help to make it more transparent and can help to rebuild trust there.
One of the most tragic tales with allegations of alternative facts and fake news surrounds the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 in eastern Ukraine in July 2014, with the loss of almost 300 lives. Russia strongly denies any responsibility, but those intent on exposing fake news point to what they say is one of their greatest successes.
I think from a purely propagandist aspect was the case of MH17, because what you saw coming from the Russian Ministry of Defense in their July 21st press conference on, a few days after MH17 was shot down are all provable lies. And really, when you think about it, nearly 300 people had died, and the first reaction from Russia was to present fakes, lie about their evidence, and they were completely shameless about it. And to compound that, 2 years later, they said they had lost their radar data, and all of a sudden they find it again. But this time, the radar data, which had previously shown a Ukrainian jet near MH17, didn't show anything near MH17. So their own data contradicted their own press conference. So, when you have that level of just barefaced lying, I mean, that is really, it's hard to beat that.
So we've seen some of the devastating effects that fake news can have, particularly in war zones. Here in Ukraine, where nearly 10,000 people have died in the ongoing conflict, they're still searching for solutions.